I said, we thought it fitting to begin today's webinar with Dr. King's voice itself, in that he very much was invested in not only social justice for all of America, but also economic justice. And much of the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign, which he was promoting as a part of this speech, very much aligns with the agenda of our network and the Economic Opportunity Act. And so that just gives you a bit of insight, and with that in mind, I would like to go to our next slide and say in a different way. And so as a network, really the heart or the center of our work is to fight poverty. Anti-poverty work is the heart of what we do, and as we proceed through today's webinar, we thought it would be fitting to also just ground our conversation not only in the words of Dr. King, but in the promise of community action itself, which says community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. And I think the phrase to stress is that we care about the entire community, and that says that across racial or race, class, gender, religion, just all aspects of person's existence within the communities that we serve, that we care about their well-being and also their ability to access opportunity that allows them to experience a thriving reality. And so as community action colleagues, we also understand that you are keenly aware of the barriers that stand in the way of opportunity and economic security for America's families. And we also further understand racial bias and consequently institutional racism as barriers to success for families. And so looking to the North Star, as we have already alluded to, or as I've already alluded to, in the early 1960s, community action was born amidst various social tensions. Those tensions cut across several dimensions, but certainly it cut across racial lines and economic justice lines. And in those moments, in those most tense moments as a network, as we were seeking to meet the needs of vulnerable families and vulnerable communities, we learned how to navigate our way through adversity and look to the North Star in pursuit of opportunity and stability for the families being held captive by poverty. And collectively, as we look into our current reality, which in some ways doesn't look much different from aspects of what was playing out in the global landscape over 50 years ago, we will continue as a network to look in the right direction towards the path of opportunity and really towards a reality where all of the persons in our communities can succeed and thrive, as I've already said. And so then to say a little bit more about the community action partnerships, truth, racial healing, and transformation strategy, or our racial equity strategy, our commitment is to build the partnerships, internal capacity to support narrative change and organizational transformation from the racial equity perspective. And ways that we have done this up to this point have been really intensive training for the board of directors, for the partnership, as well as intensive training for the partnership staff, and then ongoing conversations around how we might strengthen our work for the network going forward. And then looking at that next bullet, we are deeply committed to strengthening the leadership capacity of local community action agencies and state community action associations and other stakeholders. And we're hoping to build this capacity with hopes of fostering a more equitable reality within respective organizational structures and service delivery strategies. And so our long-term goal is that as we provide resources and information and training and technical assistance to the larger network, that ultimately local agencies will begin to look at the policies, structures, practices in such a way that those become more inclusive and equitable in nature, and in many ways seek to dismantle any institutional racism and other isms that might currently pervade their ability to do what they do on the front lines. And then in addition to that, from a service delivery standpoint, our hope is to also build capacity to inform a more, how can I say, holistic or it's the opposite of trauma. Well, yeah, trauma-informed service delivery strategies such that those who are impacted by racism and the other isms are no longer traumatized, but really empowered in a way that helps to propel them forward. And so today's webinar is an example of one of the efforts that we are engaged in from a capacity standpoint. We offer a racial equity webinar series to the entire network, and we'll continue to be able to offer those to the network in this year and going forward. We continue to offer conference, workshop presentations, as well as resources and readings. And as I alluded to before, we are available to state associations and local agencies to provide technical assistance to help you sort of think about your organizations and how you might function in a more intersectional or inclusive manner. And long-term, we also hope to develop a community of practice where colleagues across the Community Action Network can continue to join together in resource sharing and really peer-to-peer support around fostering potentially fostering a racial healing network within community action as well. And so that just sort of gives you a glimpse of some things that we have been working on and really have upheld as a priority, as a partnership, and we just wanted to elevate that with all of you today. And with that said, it is my pleasure to reintroduce our special guest, who is not a stranger to us because he is one of us, Dr. Dalitso Sulamoyo, who will share some words of inspiration and maybe challenge to us as we remember the awesome legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Dalitso, it's all you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Thank you for the opportunity to address the network on celebrating Dr. King's life. Thank you to the partnership for again giving me this opportunity to be part of this webinar where we will honor the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. On Monday, we commemorated what would have been his 89th birthday. This year, we will also be commemorating and reflecting on 50 years since Dr. King was tragically taken from us by a cowardly and hateful assassin. Dr. King embodied courage, conviction, and compassion for those whom society chose to disenfranchise. Each one of us today is responsible for living out the ideal that Dr. King and others of his time offered up to this country and world. I deeply believe that while Dr. King was fashioned by God for his time, you and I were molded and shaped for this present age. The question is, will we use our inheritance and transform this society and world, or will we squander these gifts by failing to see injustice, hate, and suffering that stares us in the face every day? If Dr. King were alive today, what would he think of today's social and economic justice issues? Would he acknowledge progress that has been made since the 1960s, or would he acknowledge the insurmountable work that we still have ahead of us? Would he see aspects of his dream realized, or would it all have been inspirational but illusory? There is no denying that progress has been made since the 1960s. However, there is still a lot of work to be done in the social and economic justice arena. According to Pew, black men are 6 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated in federal and state prisons and local jails today. This is an increase from 1960, when black men were 5 times as likely as whites to be incarcerated. According to the NAACP, African Americans constitute 34% of the total correctional population. There are over 40 million Americans living in poverty today, and we have the highest child poverty rates in the developed world. America has 6 times as many firearm homicides as Canada, and nearly 16 times as many as Germany. In 2017, in our great city of Chicago, we had over 500 homicides. So as we sit through this webinar this afternoon, there are over 800,000 young dreamers who face deportation if Congress and the administration will not take the appropriate action to secure their future in America. The gap in household income between blacks and whites has not narrowed in the last 50 years. Black children are more likely than whites to live in areas of concentrated poverty, and finally, our schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980. These are but a few statistics to help us gauge our social and economic justice barometer and why we need to continue to fight for racial equity. These statistics should prick our consciousness so that as we address poverty in local areas, we should look at institutional poverty and institutional racism and the disparities and inequalities that exist in our communities. As unfortunate as all these statistics are, they should serve a purpose. They should serve the purpose of punctuating our society into radical change. They should serve the purpose of placing us into a state of disequilibrium and dissonance so as to provide us with a new perspective and will to fight for social and economic justice and racial equity. They should serve as our constant reminders that many of these deep-seated and fundamental issues remain unresolved because they are adaptive in nature. They are adaptive because they are not easily resolved, and they cannot be resolved by any old formulas and approaches. Our challenge has been that perhaps we have tried to resolve these issues with the same approaches and methods, and as a result, our efforts have not been sustainable. If our communities cannot learn new ways through changing attitudes, values, and behaviors, we will not make the adaptive leap necessary to build new communities of equity in social and economic justice. We would have failed to change the game. We need a new reality. Change begins with us if we're going to change the realities of our communities. Tragic events such as the ones in North Charleston, South Carolina, Ferguson, Missouri, Sanford, Florida, Falcon Heights, Minnesota have happened on many occasions in the past. However, when these unfortunate incidences occur, there is a public outcry, perhaps some activity for awareness, and then the status quo is maintained. We need to stop being reactionary and build united communities and lasting movements that will result in institutional changes. We need to have communities and movements where our young men and women or athletes should not feel threatened to express themselves on issues of social justice. Communities where young people of color should not feel threatened to express themselves on issues of social and racial justice. Standing up for unjust issues does not mean that you're unpatriotic or do not love this country. It actually means that you love this country and want it to live out the ideals it has enshrined in the Constitution. Let us not forget that most social movements were not popular during their time. The Freedom Riders had a disapproval rating of 61%, and according to Gallup, Dr. King had a positive rating of 32% and a negative rating of 63%. So we need to build communities where the police are truly part of every community. We need to build communities that make racial profiling a thing of the past. We need to build communities that say no to racism, gun violence, and discrimination. To do so, we not only need to talk about race and racism through an open dialogue, but that actions need to be undertaken that will fundamentally and radically change how we live in our communities. If discussing these issues makes us uncomfortable, then I say that is a great thing. We cannot carry out fundamental change without having the feelings of discomfort. With all the political freedoms that exist in this country, there are shattered people who languish in the gutters of despair and depression, sentenced to limited visions and stifled dreams. They need us all to live out the ideals of Dr. King and have the courage and conviction of speaking truth to power. As an immigrant from Malawi, the issue of immigration reform is very near and dear to my heart, as I have many friends and relatives who are hiding in the shadows because of immigration technicalities. Let me share a story of you of a friend of mine, and his name is Ben. He came to America in pursuit of higher education and a better life, like many of us did years ago. Ben's dreams were stifled when his father suddenly passed away in Malawi. He could no longer stay in school as he had to find the means to support himself here in America. He found himself in violation of his student visa and was soon arrested by immigration authorities. Ben spent over 2 months in a detention center with hardcore criminals. He was eventually deported back to Malawi with no education and just the clothes on his back. Ben assumed the role of a father figure to his siblings in the absence of his father. Without a college degree, Ben tried to provide for his family the best way he could. A couple years ago, Ben died from a sudden illness. Since learning about his death, I have wondered what Ben could have become had he managed to stay in America and completed his education. There are many faces to the issue of immigration, even though the rhetoric we have heard in Washington, D.C. has had racial overtones. We should not be distracted by inflammatory and derogatory words. We should focus on the proposed policies that may be destructive. Where is the justice when you have individuals who came to this country just as our founding fathers did for a better life and freedom, and yet they are criminalized for it? Where is the justice when persons of color are profiled in Arizona just because they're suspected of being undocumented? We are, after all, a nation of immigrants. Even if some of us are more recent than others, we all love this country. We need to remind each other that love is more than a nice salutation to be used in letters and greeting cards. Love is immeasurable and a powerful force that can transform people and nations. This divine love that Dr. Martin Luther King and numerous community activists talked about and bequeathed to us is a balm that can heal our political and spiritual wounds. Dr. King understood that there's a need for this nation to become self-reflective, not only in its strength militarily, but spiritually and morally as well. In these uncertain and volatile times, we need community activists to wage a war of love and compassion, to wage a war on indifference. For in these times, it is very easy to sacrifice the needs of those who have very little political power. It should be our legacy to proudly and loudly be a voice for those whose passion for life has been sucked out of them through circumstances and tragedies. For a nation is not ultimately judged by how it caters to the desires of the powerful, but how it responds to the needs of the powerless. Our salvation is dependent in part on how we treat the least of these, our brothers and sisters. Massive poverty and obscene inequality are such terrible scourges of our times that they have to rank alongside slavery and Jim Crow as social evils, and yet these are times in which the world boasts breathtaking advances in science, technology, industry, and wealth accumulation. Millions of people in this country's poorest communities remain imprisoned and trapped in the prison of poverty. It is time to set them free. Nelson Mandela said, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. And overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life. While poverty persists, there is no true freedom. So it is not acceptable to retreat from the front lines of the war on poverty, nor is it acceptable to balance our budgets on the backs of poor people. We need a brazen surge to relaunch the war on poverty. We need legislative initiatives that will be conducive to building more ladders of opportunity for the working poor to climb into the middle class. Dr. King knew how the power and strength of the human spirit can overcome the ills of this world. He dreamed of a better world, which he selflessly promised by risking his own life. When we reflect on what he did for this world, we laud him for his heroism and sacrifice. And yet, he was not trying to be a hero. He knew that this world was divinely created and equally promised each one of us. He understood that through self-empowerment, we can overcome and transcend our obstacles in life. If Dr. King was not a dreamer and an activist with the courage to speak truth to power, desegregation could have been delayed and the Voting Rights Act could have been in jeopardy. We need to be vigilant in fighting any voter suppression legislation sponsored by those who want to disenfranchise others for them to remain in power. So, what are we doing for others on issues of social justice? Where are today's dreamers and social activists when we have stomach-churning headlines every time we turn on the news? Where are today's unifiers when it seems we are diverging and not converging as a society? We have to change the dynamics of our society by getting more people to vote. That is the only way we can get the people's issues on the forefront of dialogue and action. If there are 45 million people living in poverty, they could become a voting bloc on poverty issues so that there are more opportunities to advance in the middle class. If we can effectively organize and educate the affected on the issues, we can empower a whole movement of people to change this society. Only then can we boldly say that if you do not stand with the people will not stand with you. We need men and women of courage and conviction. The need is echoed throughout this country more than ever before. I see this as an opportunity for us to be engaged and to act selflessly for others. Throughout my journey of practicing leadership in community action, I've learned that leadership is not only about inspiration, but that leadership is about perspiration. And I hope that our time together on this webinar today is not only about seeking inspiration, but that we will leave this webinar feeling challenged to act for social, racial, and economic justice. You cannot be a dreamer without having both perspiration and inspiration, courage, conviction, commitment, and compassion. How will you keep Dr. King's dream alive when you leave this webinar this afternoon? What will be your contribution toward economic and social justice? We should never be satisfied until our institutions and society provide paths of equity and opportunities for all. So in closing, Dr. King said, "Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be dissatisfied until those who live on the outskirts of hope are brought into the metropolis of daily security. Let us be dissatisfied until slums are cast into the junk heaps of history and every family will live in a decent sanitary home. Let us be dissatisfied until every state capital will be housed by a governor who will do justly, who will love mercy, and who will walk humbly with God. Let us be dissatisfied until that day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everybody will talk about God's power and human power." Thank you, Community Action, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, very, 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 very timely word, and I love that challenge that you just gave to us in terms of what will be our contribution towards social and economic justice today. As we move forward in our conversation today, I'd like to open the floor. What questions or comments do folks have to offer to our conversation today? Feel free to use the chat window and write to us and let us know what you're thinking. What questions or comments or reflections do you have? My colleague Hyacinth McKinley is also putting in a question. Tell us what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. means to you. We'd love to hear your voices in this discussion, and Dr. Sulamoyo really put things in perspective in terms of sort of narrating or painting the picture of the state of things today and really what the important opportunities, and not only opportunities, imperatives there are out there for us as community action colleagues. Any responses so far? We're going to give you all an opportunity to kind of stew on that a little bit, and as you stew on it, I want to go ahead and transition and give you something to listen to. So recently, several colleagues from the network had various reflections to offer on their own about Dr. King and his legacy. They shared that with us last week during the Management Leadership Training Conference, and so we're going to go ahead and run the audio of those reflections. You can access the reflections yourself via YouTube, and we might even be able to put that in the chat window for you. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and play the audio just so that you can hear what other colleagues from around the nation are thinking as they reflect on the legacy of Dr. King.
He inspired me to really get engaged and begin to do the work. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've always been in the helping field. And when I look back over some of the teachings and readings that he did, which inspired people, I felt really compelled and grateful to be in this line of work, to be able to really carry on some of the work that he started.
Well, I was a second grader when Martin Luther King died, and I remember everything being so tense around that time, and it was just this sense of hopelessness because he was a beacon of hope for America, and not only African Americans, but the world. And so, to me, it was a reason for us all to pick up the torch and not to ever let it fall.
And I remember growing up listening to Dr. King's speeches, reading about the work that he did to bring about equality at all levels in America. And growing up in that country, which was an authoritarian regime, the work that he did in this country made so much sense to me that I chose the path to work in social and economic justice.
He was charismatic. He knew how to capture the attention of the people in our hearts. He had a lot of heart and soul preacher, right? So he knew how to talk to everyone, and he knew how to capture the heart and soul of the situation.
Look at the power of words and the power of how many years this has been laid, and these words are so powerful. Some of the speeches that I listen to now almost to me are mirror exactly what we're going through in our world today. And so it's an inspiration to know that you can dream big, you can apply something to your life, and you can affect change in people, in communities, in neighborhoods. And so it's an inspiration to us all.
Even though he's no longer alive, everything that he wrote in the past is actually present now in the future. And one of his quotes that I love is that he always says that we don't walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. And that's what a change agent does. All of us here in America are immigrants, and we cannot separate what made us the powerful nation that we are.
As long as Dr. King was around, I kind of believed that it was all peaceful and everybody was getting along until the 1969 type race riots in Kansas City. I heard more than once, and I said more than once, if Dr. King was alive, what would happen? So that's what
the roots of Dr. King's work happened in an African-American church in one of our target neighborhoods. And so we've grown up working with the giants that were the founders of the structure of the Southern Christian Leadership Organization, and helped put our city together to honor the work of Dr. King. I'm honored that the young man sitting next to me, a former student and now one of my senior team members, is serving as this year's co-chair of the Martin Luther King Holiday Celebration.
So what would Dr. King say? See what's going on in our world today. The fact that we still have a lot of inequality. We can look at the incarceration rates of African Americans compared to their counterparts. We look at pay rates, how those are so unequal. I think we need more Dr. King today to stand up to all the issues that we're facing in our world.
So that's just a tidbit from the Community Action Commemoration video, and we encourage you to access the link that we have provided in the chat window. We will also provide it in the slide deck for you to go back and watch the full footage of the reflections from your colleagues from around the country. So it does look like a question has come in on the chat window, and so Dalitso, our colleague, is Melinda Galt, and her question is, how can we engage the young leaders in our communities to express our dissatisfaction in the initiatives of the early 1960s? Hopefully I got that right.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, as I pointed out in my remarks, I think that the movements of the 1960s at the time were not as popular. And I think today, as young people are trying to express themselves on issues of whether it's racial issues or social justice issues, we should be supporting them and not condemning them. And they may be expressing themselves differently than folks did in the 1960s. Our role should be to encourage them to speak out on issues that are affecting our community and society today.
Thank you very much. And so you've alluded to this a little bit, but can you offer colleagues some perspective on just some practical things that local agencies can do right now in terms of advancing the cause for social justice and economic justice? Like, what are some practical things that you have seen that work?
Well, I think the first thing, we all have to be is aware of what is going on around us. There's a lot of things that we're reading in the media about what's being said and what's being done. But at the local level, I think what we need to do as community action is to be the conveners to discuss all of these issues. Our role as community action agencies should always be to be the convener in our community. And that gives us the opportunity to bring in the young folks or anybody else in the community that cares about certain issues. So I see community action as being the focal point, the organization that convenes discussions about social and economic justice issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So we just want to take this time to thank you again for sharing with us those words of wisdom and those words of inspiration. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule as a CEO of a local agency. It shows that this conversation is very close to your heart, and really what I want to say to all of us on today's webinar is that we all need to keep this conversation close to our hearts, in that our families and communities are dependent on us. They could depend on us over 50 years ago, and they can still depend on us today. And so as different things are happening in your local communities. We would love to hear about what those things are, just so that we can remain connected as a community in this space. Also, there are future capacity building opportunities that the partnership will be facilitating, so do be on the lookout for upcoming webinars and offerings through our national conferences. As we conclude today, I want to highlight for you various resources that we have available on the partnership website. On the screen, there are two resources that are written by John Powell. John Powell actually was a keynote speaker at the Partnership's annual convention in 2017, and he spoke a lot about this whole notion of implicit bias and this whole notion of belongingness. And so the first publication that you see there is called Addressing Implicit Bias, Racial Anxiety and Stereotype Threat in Education and Healthcare, and the second publication, Poverty and Race Through a Belongingness Lens. And so as we look at the next slide, still there are some additional resources, and I must say that the publication Equity, Growth, and Community is really a must-read in terms of understanding how some of the equity trends are playing out in America's metro or urban areas. That book is authored by Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner. It's a free book that you can download in total, so we invite you to check that out, as well as The Cost of Segregation. And, you know, we'll just scroll through to just show you a few more of these publications. The partnership is one of the over 100+ national organizations who have partnered with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in their Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation initiative. And they are really committed to working in local spaces and local places to not only convene communities together in dialogue, but to also seek to build capacity and really help community leaders think about systems level changes that might lead to transformation. And Dalitso spoke earlier about this whole notion of truth telling. So naming or speaking the truth in terms of what the realities are. And according to the TRHT approach, it really does start with speaking the true narrative. And there are many painful and traumatic aspects of that, but in naming that narrative, it really creates an opportunity to then redirect or change that narrative in a way that creates a path for all of us to heal. Because really when one aspect of our society is oppressed or experiences racism or the isms or brokenness, not only does that group suffer, really we all suffer. And so if we're going to truly go forward, the narrative has to shift, and we have to develop strategies that are sustainable strategies through our individual behaviors, through our organizational practices, and through our policies that exist within our communities and our society in order to go forward and truly live into that new reality that Dalitso spoke about as well, or to live into what Dr. King would call that beloved community. And so TRHT has an implementation guide related to their efforts that you can download for free. Additionally, our colleagues over at Prosperity Now within the last year published a publication called The Ever-Growing Gap: Without Change, African American and Latino Families Won't Match White Wealth for Centuries. But it lays out the data, or it paints a picture of the wealth gap that exists across across racial lines, and really challenges us to sort of think more deeply about how we might try to get ahead of the trend to basically stop it, because not only, according to this publication, does the amount of wealth for African Americans and Latinos decrease significantly as projected by 2043, with that trend, given that by 2043 the majority population in America will be over 50% persons of color, that has an impact on the entire society, as I have already alluded to earlier. So looking at the next slide, let's see. So further resources, and we'll go to the next slide. And the one that I'll call out is one put out by Policy Link called the National Equity Atlas, which is a wonderful resource that you may choose to tap into to assist with community assessment analysis as you do those for your agency. And then the next slide, yes, is taken from a documentary series that is also funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. It's called America Divided, and cuts across various dimensions, from housing disparity, health disparity, in mass incarceration of persons of color, but as it puts it in a real-life context to help foster conversation. So, for example, if your local agency just wanted to build its own capacity and learn a little bit more and wanted a space to be able to dialogue, this documentary really lays some good foundation to start those conversations so that you might delve more deeply. And so, as I mentioned, all of these resources are available on the partnership's website, www.communityactionpartnership.com, and if you hover over programs and resources, the racial equity link will pop up, and you can click on it to go to all of the wonderful resources that we have available. We would also like to invite you to subscribe to the Learning Communities Resource Center blog, to become a follower there. There again, as we upload new resources, you receive real-time updates or emails about those new resources. And finally, we want to just invite you all to consider joining our learning community. The learning community is intended to build the network's capacity to fight poverty more effectively, and we understand that in order to address the causes and the conditions of poverty, that we can't talk about poverty without talking about race. And so you'll find that in the offerings for this upcoming year, the racial equity lens is really applied across all of our topic areas to help to deepen our network's understanding about ways that we might strengthen our service delivery efforts, within that racial equity space. So we invite you to learn more about the learning community, and if you're interested in signing up as a member, our deadline is actually tomorrow, so why don't you join us? And so I think that might be the last slide, maybe, yes, no, yes, and so you can go to the next one. Oh, and we have some more questions, so let's take a look at those real quickly. And, okay, so here's one. Can you share some strategies for dealing with naysayers? What can CAAs do to combat false or harmful narratives in their communities? So Dalitso, did you hear that question? Strategies for dealing with naysayers. What can CAAs do to combat false or harmful narratives in their communities?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I think we have to continue working on doing a better job of telling our story and telling the story of our community and the community that we serve, and focusing a lot on the successes that we're having, because a lot of times I think what we hear about our work is not always positive. And so as we work on whether it's Roma and other means of collecting our outcomes, we need to control the narrative about what we're doing in our communities. I think that helps to address issues and naysayers that may be out there in our communities.
Yeah, and what I will add to that is there's nothing like data. And, there are like several resources that I've just shared with us in the resource review a minute ago. There's a lot of data to support the various trends, right, that we have spoken about that continue to pervade our society, especially for persons of color. And so I think to just be able to not only create spaces to connect with colleagues so that the conversation can happen and so that, we can even develop that sense of connectedness and belongingness and empathy for one another. But in addition to that, just to have the facts and, the truth of the matter to share in a way that maybe might offer a little more perspective into the conversations. That webinar, not the webinar, but the documentary series that I just mentioned, America Divided, is a wonderful, wonderful tool. I cannot stress it enough as a resource, as well as there's a resource I didn't call out. It's called, we're going to go back one more slide. Yes, Under Our Skin. That is a tool that is also a wonderful tool to foster dialogue. It offers many videos related to various issues from prejudice, structural racism, just the whole gamut, and it's spoken about from the perspective of people across all races, gender, the whole 9 yards. And so the attempt is to offer really an intersectional perspective, about those various topics. And I know here at the partnership, we have committed to regular racial equity conversations as a team. So it's about every couple of months or so, colleagues will just join together around the lunch table, which I regard, sharing a meal with colleagues as probably, it doesn't happen as much, in today's society. But so that within itself is revolutionary, that we would just take the time to share lunch. But in those lunch conversations, we have viewed the Under Our Skin videos. We have viewed the America Divided documentary series as a way of having conversations that hopefully help us to make some deeper kinds of connections to get past some of the misunderstanding. And so there's another question, and maybe we'll make this the last question because I just talked a whole lot there. Do you envision a wave of social acknowledgement and public accountability in the near future, similar to the Me Too movement? That's an interesting question. So you want to take a stab at that one?
Let me give some quick thought on that. So meaning having a big social movement on any particular issue, poverty, or are we talking about racial justice?
Racial justice.
Well, I mean, I think it takes an incident to spark a movement. I mean, with the Me Too movement, even though these issues have been around for some time, it took someone bringing out the issues that Harvey Weinstein was doing, and that mushroomed into this movement that's led to, I think, a lot of great changes in how, maybe men were interacting with women in the workplace. I think we have to continue making these issues be at the forefront, whether it's racial issues. We shouldn't shy away, even if the press or the other folks in the community may take a negative stance at bringing out issues of racial injustice. We need to continue keeping them at the forefront. That's the only way that we can see any results or any change occurring. If I could go back to a comment you made earlier, Tiffany, regarding data, and whether it's poverty or racial or whatever it is, I think that as organizations, we need to really become more sophisticated in working with data, not just collecting data, but also analyzing data so that we can use data to change the game, if you will, to tell the story and be able to really bring about institutional change. And that, I think, is a capacity we need to really focus on as organizations. Providing services is great, but we have to develop our capacity and develop a culture of data within our organizations.
That is a wonderful, wonderful final word. We want to thank you again for joining us today to offer your wisdom and inspiration. So thank you very much, Dr. Sulamoyo. And we also want to thank all of you, our wonderful community action colleagues. This is important work, and we will move forward in cultivating that beloved community that Dr. King spoke of, whereby we all might belong and have access to opportunities so that we might all thrive. We thank you. Have a wonderful day. This concludes today's webinar. Take care.